teasing you. I'm just teasing you.
We're gonna get the whole flavor here.
Okay.
I have tried, frankly, to think about things that other people did, not just what I did.
Yeah,
I did so many idiotic things myself that I might throw one, two of them in, but
That's
generally,
That's fine. There's nothing
Y'all go
no
ahead.
specific. Are we already?
You're on.
we
Go
are.
ahead.
Okay, I'll start then. The Greensboro Bar Association is interviewing some of its senior members for their recollection of people and events of interest to the bar and to the community. This is the 15th day of December 2000, and we are speaking with R. Dick Douglas, Jr. in his home on Pleasant Ridge Road. Members of the Greensboro Bar Association Archives Committee present are Mark Gaylord and me, Richmond Rip Bernhardt. We may be joined by Fred Lynn and Horace Carnegie if they're able to be present. I will lead off, but would invite others present to comment on anything or ask you any questions that occur to them. Even though you are a few years my senior, you always treated me graciously.
How many is a few?
You always treated me graciously on a first-name basis and allowed me to reciprocate. Thus, I would like, consistent with the informality of this conversation, to call you by your first name, if that's okay.
When you get my age, you don't like the Mr. all the time. I know young fellas start off calling me Mr., and that's appropriate till you get permission to drop it.
All right.
But I tell all the youngsters that my name is Dick, and forget the Mr. business.
So I have your permission then.
Yes, indeed.
First, we would like to ask some factual information and then go from there. And first, would you tell us where you were born and when you were born?
I was born on July 27th, 1912, about 3 months, I think, after the sinking of the Titanic, which is a current interest. I was born in Greensboro, up on Price Street, just off of Smith and Green Street. I don't think they call it Price now.
Did you grow up in Greensboro?
I grew up in Greensboro. My folks built a house out in Fisher Park Circle, and we moved in there when I was 4 months old. But I've lived all my life, gone to school here, and just all my life, never lived anywhere else.
Where did you attend high school?
I went to Greensboro High School. About the time I finished, they had built Grimsley over on Westover, but Greensboro High was on South Spring Street, about where Washington Street comes into Spring Street.
And then after high school, did you attend college and where?
I went to Georgetown University in Washington. My father had graduated from Georgetown in 1896 and my grandfather in 1867, so I expect I was supposed to go there all the time. I went there for 4 years of college. I got a degree, you know, instead of an A.B. or B.S., if you majored in philosophy, metaphysics, theodicy, theopsy, major and minor logic, and that kind of thing, you got a degree of Bachelor of Philosophy. I don't think anybody gets, not even Georgetown anymore, but I have a PhD, and I graduated in 1932. Then I took a year's graduate work in philosophy, thinking at the time, it's funny about being a lawyer, all my life, I can remember when I was a little child, people pat me on the head and say, I guess you're going to be a lawyer like your daddy and your grandfather and your great-grand and so on. And I rebelled all through college. I had been out here and there. I had explored some of Alaska, and I'd been down in Africa where I shot a lion with a bow and arrow when I was 16 years old. That's one of the things I talk about sometimes.
Was that a fatal bow and arrow shot?
Took a second arrow to finish him off.
I see. At what range were you when you shot the line?
About 50 yards. Anyway, I had gotten interested in outdoor things, and all through college, I decided I was going to be a forester in the National Park Service or something like that. I was going to go to Cornell maybe for graduate work. But the banks had all failed, and Georgetown said, if you stay here, we'll give you some jobs. I worked in the laundry up there and in the post office and so on. And then I went 3 years to law school. I guess the law in the blood came out, notwithstanding my many, many years, I'm not going to be a lawyer.
What year was it then that you graduated?
I graduated from Georgetown Law School in 1936.
And then did you take the bar examination here in North Carolina?
Well, with my friend Charlie Hagan, we went down to, Charlie had graduated at the University of Virginia, and we knew in particular cases the majority rule is this, the minority rule is that, but we didn't know what the North Carolina rule was. So Charlie and I took about a 6 weeks cram course from Dr. Gully down at Old Wake Forest, just out of Raleigh. And then Charlie and I took the bar together in the summer, August of 36.
Where did you take the bar examination?
We took the bar in the old Capitol building. I must tell you, it was August, it was not air conditioned, it was hot. It was so hot, if you lifted up your hand, your papers came up with it. You were sweating or perspiring, and it was terribly hot. I remember one thing particularly. I had been taught at Georgetown that you get an answer right or you get it wrong. Some of my friends at Chapel Hill were taught if you don't know the answer, then discuss the general principles involved and maybe you get 50%. Well, at Georgetown, the ideal answer was, should the plaintiff recover? The answer was yes, Marsh versus Green, no more. Of course, if you quoted the wrong case, you were wrong. But down there at Georgetown, at the bar examination, for example, without making this too long, I believe the question says, the plaintiff sued the defendant for negligence, then and so on and so on. And the defendant came back with contributory negligence on the part of the plaintiff. And then, however, it was proved that the defendant could have stopped and could have done this, but didn't. Now, some of my friends spent maybe 20 minutes on that question, and it was so hot and they were working over it. I did as I had done in law school. Defendant guilty of negligence. Plaintiff contributory negligence. Defendant last clear chance. Hold for the defendant. And as a result, I finished the 3-hour bar exam in about 48 or 50 minutes. And oh, I could see those boys sweating away hot as hell. I got up, walked out. I could feel them saying, I hope that SOB fails. But it was a rough bar exam, very hot.
Thinking about the Capitol building where you took the examination, was it in one of the houses?
Yes, I think it was in the house.
In the house, which has now been restored, as I understand it.
I haven't been there in some years, but I understand it is, yes.
And then you came to Greensboro to practice law, is that true?
Yes, in those days, the young lawyer, and I'm speaking of those 8 or 10 I knew in Greensboro, ideally you got associated with some law firm. You might be paid $40 or $50 a month, but you're willing to do that to work with a law firm. Incidentally, along that line, there was a Colonel Frank Hobgood, a prominent trial lawyer here. And if you wanted to go to work for him, you paid him $75 a month. You didn't get paid anything yourself. You got associated with some firm if you could. If you couldn't, you were on your own. You tried your best. Of course, I moved in with my father, who had been a lawyer for he and his father and his father and his father and so on back, been lawyers. And a young lawyer looked around, didn't have any money, you looked around, you got a room somewhere in a private home. You couldn't afford an apartment. You got a room on the third floor of somebody, or second floor. And you were told if you had no firm to send you around, hang around the courthouse. Just sit in on the courtrooms, and whenever court adjourned, get up and walk out and stand out in the hall and look sort of ponderous as if you were thinking of some big legal thing. And you'd be surprised how many people who just come to watch the court, and with no particular television or radio going on then, a lot of people went to the courtroom for entertainment. And you'd be surprised how many people, seeing this young man, obviously a lawyer, he looks like a lawyer, would come up and say, "I got a little problem, can you draw a deed for me, or check a title or something?" So you'd pick up business there.
Let me interrupt you to ask you to tell us about your father and your grandfather and your earlier ancestors who were in, who practiced law here in Greensboro.
Well, my father was a lawyer for about 65 years in Greensboro. I'll mention later something about Douglas Forms, a book he was very proud of. His father, Robert M. Douglas, was a lawyer here and on the North Carolina Supreme Court back around 1900 to 1904, I think. I may be off a year. His father was Stephen A. Douglas, who was a lawyer out in Illinois and a member of the United States Senate. He was the one who debated Lincoln in 1868 for the Illinois Senate, and then ran, he was a Democratic nominee for president in 1860, and Lincoln beat him in that.
Let me interrupt you there, Dick, if I may. You were sitting in your living room, and over your fireplace is his portrait, I believe. And I'm wondering if Mark could focus in on with a video.
Yeah, that was a portrait of Senator Douglas. Douglas, I'll brag just a little, was a wonderful speaker. And Daniel Webster in those days had died. Henry Clay was ailing, and John C. Calhoun, another great speaker in the Senate, was on his last legs. And Douglas was chairman of the Committee on Territories. And in 1849, or maybe 47, I think, G.P. Healy, a prominent American portrait painter, painted that picture up there of he was my great-grandpa. On the Dick side, we go back still another generation. My grandfather, Robert M. Douglas, married Jessie Dick, whose father was Robert P. Dick, who was a judge, federal judge here and on the North Carolina Supreme Court. And his father, John McClintock Dick, was a Superior Court judge in, I think, 1830 to 1860. That's a picture of him, if you could see that. I don't know if the light will show that, Mark. That's John McClintock Dick. And also, I must say that I have a son named Bob Douglas. Not long ago, I was telling a friend, I said, all these years I've been introduced, oh yeah, he was the grandson of the debating Stephen A. Douglas. Now, just when I think I'm making it on my own, I don't do it. You must be Bob Douglas' daddy. My son Bob gets around a whole lot more than I, knows more people, knows more lawyers here than I do. So I've gone from a descendant to an ancestor, never quite made it on my own.
Well, now, Bob Douglas is R.D. Douglas III.
That's right, yeah.
And you're R.D. Douglas.
I was junior all my life, and even though my dad has been dead about 40 years, I've just kept the junior.
Right.
My mother out at Merrifield Nursing Home about 30 years ago, by the way, called me on the phone one day and said, Robert, she always called me by my first name, do you still use the word junior on your name? And I said, of course I do, Mother. Well, see that you do. She says, when I'm dead, you can do what you please, but I'm Mrs. Douglas Sr., and don't you drop that junior. Mother lived to be 102, and I'm shooting for the high 90s, but I don't know.
What year did she pass away?
She died in, I have to think, about 20 years ago.
Well, you've been in a family of distinguished lawyers and judges, and obviously they have meant a lot to you in your career. I wonder if there are any other lawyers that you remember fondly as being a good influence on you.
Well, I knew Judge Tom Shaw pretty well, and I should tell a little story. I was hanging around the courtroom like all the young lawyers did. I'd been practicing law about 6 months maybe, and Judge Tom Shaw, Superior Court judge, ruled the case. I don't remember the details, but I remember very vividly his saying, "I'm going to find for the plaintiff. I don't want to, it's not just, and I wish I could hold for the defendant. But my job, I'm sworn to follow the law, and the law is clear, so I've got to hold for the plaintiff, much as I dislike it." And I thought to myself, well, that's fine. Here's a man that says we're a judgment of law, and he's following the law. About 2 weeks later, I was in another courtroom over in the same courthouse, and Judge Hoyle Sink, who came from Lexington, I think, Judge Sink was holding court. And again, I don't know the case, but Judge Sink says, "I'm going to hold for the defendant in this case." And as I believe Tom Hoyle, not the old man, young Tom, he's older than I am, but he's dead now. Young Tom says, "If Your Honor please, the case of Murkison versus so-and-so is absolutely in point." And Judge Sink says, "I'm not here to get fouled up on case law." He says, "My job is to mete out justice, and it requires that I hold for the defendant." And Judge Tom Hoyle says, "Your Honor, I've got another case." Judge Sink says, "Don't bother me with cases. If you don't like what I do, you take it to the boys down in Raleigh. I'm going to hold for the defendant, and don't bother me with the law. It is just and proper that I hold for the defendant." So I went back to my dad and I said, "What'd I do?" Judge Shaw says, "Forget the facts, follow the law." Judge Sink says, "The heck with the law. Let's see what justice requires." Dad said, "Well, all I can say is you can shift around a little if you get a case where you're strong on the law. Try to get it calendared for Judge Shaw. If you got a weak case, you got equity on your side, and you got some sad stories to tell, then see if you can delay it till you get Hoyle Sink on the court." I still remember that very vividly.
Judge Sink liked to walk around the courtroom while the trial was in process. Do you remember that?
He did, yes, sir. Incidentally, speaking of other judges and young lawyers, we had a judge who was a judge of the municipal court. We don't have that now. It was kin to the district court now, I guess. And Judge Earl Reeves, everybody called him Scrubby Reeves, except us young lawyers, of course. He was Judge Reeves. Well, Judge Reeves loved to hunt in the fall and loved to go fishing in the spring and the summer. And he personally claims to have got a bill through the legislature, a special bill allowing him, as judge of the municipal court of Greensboro, to appoint substitute judges. And every time, if about 10 o'clock in the morning, if it was a pretty day, a young lawyer would get a call, said, "Miss So-and-so, come on over here. I'm going to get you to hold court." And the young lawyer would go and get sworn in. It might be a criminal court, might be civil, might be mixed term. And he would hold court just that afternoon. He was sworn in just for that one afternoon. And Judge Reeves could go fishing or hunting or whatever. Judge Reeves called me twice, I believe, and I had something I had to do and couldn't. So he marked me off his list. But nearly every young lawyer in Greensboro, at one time or another, would hold court over there. And some of them insist on being called judge, even if the only court they'd held was 8 months ago on a Tuesday afternoon. But that was quite a discussion.
That was in the building there on the corner of Gaston and Green.
Yeah, yes, sir.
The old city hall.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that was still in operation when I came here in 1957.
Oh, yeah.
Let me ask you if there were any classmates at Georgetown or law professors that you remember with fondness.
Well, Leo Rover, R-O-V-E-R, was district attorney for the District of Columbia, handling all criminal cases. He taught criminal law at Georgetown. We had a tax man on the tax court. I can't think of his name right now. He lectured on taxation at Georgetown. And one of the Supreme Court justices, Judge Pierce Butler, we had a debating society named for him, and I was president of the Pierce Butler Debating Society one time. He would come and talk to us every now and then. Being right there in Washington.
Is that still going now?
Sir?
Is that Butler Society still in existence, do you think?
I don't know. But we had some right interesting things. Speaking of law school, let me brag just a minute. It was the end of my senior year, and we'd finished everything, waiting about 2 days or 3 days for graduation. And I was down to law school one morning, and Dean Hugh Fagan, the dean of the law school, called me in and said, "Douglas, come in my office a minute." Well, I didn't know what was wrong. I went in his office. He said, "I want to congratulate you on leading the class." I interrupted him. I says, "Dean, I was about 19th or 20th in the class. I didn't lead the class." He says, "Don't interrupt me." He says, "I've taught you a couple of courses and you've interrupted people. Now cut it out." He says, "I want to congratulate you on leading the class of the non-students." I said, "What?" He said, "The other day at a faculty meeting, we were reviewing." He says, "Now, John Ahern, who led the class, he's a bookworm, studies all the time. Leo Conjemi, or whatever his name was, second in the class. He doesn't like to eat because it interferes with his studies." And he went on down to the next one, and he said he was third in the class, but he never dates, never goes to the movies. He studies all the time. We went down the list, we came to you, and the faculty at the law school all agreed that you don't study. You got a good mind and you pay very good attention and you read rapidly. But we want to give you a medal for being the best of the non-students." And he pulled out of his drawer, I wish it's gone now and I don't know where, a big round thing about this big cut from cardboard. And across written there to R.D. Douglas, leader of non-students, class of 36. And he had a little piece of blue ribbon stapled on the bottom of it. So I was real proud of that, but I didn't study too much.
Now, in advance of our visit here today, I asked you to think about some things that you would think may have been of interest to the members of our Bar Association and to the community. And you've given me a list of things that you've thought about, and perhaps you've touched on one or two of them already. But I see here what we would like to do, Dick, is for you to tell us about anecdotes or things that you happened to you or you observed that would be of interest to lawyers as they look back on the practice of law here in Greensboro during your time.
Well, there were a number of us who did title work. My father represented Home Federal Savings and Loan in those days, and they were the biggest savings loan around here and had a great deal of title work. And Dad did most of it. So I gravitated into that, and I cut my teeth over in the Register of Deeds vault, checking titles, looking for mortgages, liens, rights of way. And of course, as you know, if the title had gone through 3 or 4 hands of people that never did any trading, it was relatively simple. But if somebody like Bill Ross or A.K. Moore had owned the property for 2 or 3 years, then you spent 4 hours checking the ownership of that particular person to be sure that he hadn't encumbered it in any way. Times were hard, and over at the Mayfair restaurant, which is over where the First Union building, not the present First Union, only the corner of Elm and Gaston or Friendly, there was Boyd Morris's father had a cafeteria, Friendly cafeteria. And for about 40 cents, you could get a plate with the meat and 2 vegetables and bread. And for 10 cents, you get a piece of cake or a piece of pie. But even that was expensive. Now, I don't know whether the young lawyers initiated or whether the high sheriff, but word got out that up on the 4th floor of the old court, what's the old courthouse building now, that was a jail. Up on the 4th floor, the sheriff had a particular fund allotted for cornbread and buttermilk for the prisoners. And pretty soon we established a practice, us young lawyers in the courthouse over there, when it came 12:30 or so, we would go up to the 4th floor, go into one of the cells, and for 15 cents we could get all the buttermilk and all the cornbread. And I've been a lover of buttermilk all my life, but you get a big tall glass of buttermilk and take a whole lot of cornbread and put it in there and then eat it with a spoon and come back for seconds or thirds. And it was a real filling meal. It wasn't quite as good, or good for you maybe, as going over to the Mayfair cafeteria, but you saved a lot of money. I remember that.
Well, you mentioned in the courthouse, if I could just pick up on that, I had thought maybe I would ask you, but I want to ask you this now. Back in the 60s, when the county commissioners decided to build a new courthouse, which is the present courthouse, they or someone proposed to tear down the old courthouse that faces there on Market Street. And I recall that you were one of the leaders in opposition to tearing down that courthouse. And that's my recollection. What did you do, and am I right about that?
Well, you're sort of right in the conclusion, if I can grab a little bit of responsibility for it. We had a new architect who had designed the present municipal building and the present courthouse, all along the lines of 1960 architecture. And the old courthouse on Market Street, made of granite, didn't suit his plans at all. He wanted a big grass plot down there. So they all agreed to tear down the old courthouse. Well, most of what I did, I wrote a letter to the editor, and I talked about that courthouse for 40 years. It had been a focal point in Greensboro, that we use the upstairs for Boy Scout Court of Honor, what we call the big courtroom on the 2nd floor. That the Euterpe Club met there, that Women's Club met there, and men's groups, associations, that it had just that the Boy Scouts had their offices down in the basement of the old courthouse building. And I mentioned 3 or 4 churches for good measure that often had spillover crowds up there. And I said to tear down the courthouse building is just an affront to Greensboro. And besides, one of these days we're going to need it. The time will come. I wrote a right long letter. It was more than, in those days you could write 400 words instead of 200 words like the Public Pulse today. And the letter caused quite a bit of talk, and then the Boy Scouts got into it, the Euterpe Club and the Men's Club and the YMCA, and first thing we know, our architect reluctantly agreed to try to work that into his plans. I hadn't thought of that till you might haven't thought of that for years.
Well, it impressed me at the time, and I think we all owe you a debt of gratitude for helping preserve that.
Well, we need the building. I don't know what we'd put all those people. We'd have to buy the Carolina Circle Mall. I remember, I was talking about the young lawyers. When I first started practicing law, I'm not going to name any names. My father said, I want to take the list of the Greensboro Bar Association, one by one, and want to tell you how to deal with them. And the first man, and I don't know who it was now, I wouldn't tell you if I did, my father said, his word is his bond. if he'll tell you continuance, extension of time, anything in the world, you can rely on it. Don't bother to get it in writing. Came down to the second one. Says, on real important things, you better get it in writing. He won't deny that he said so and so, but he'll find some way to scare him out of it. So you better get, if you deal with him, get it in writing. He came to 2 or 3 others who were good men of their word. He came to somebody, says, no matter what he tells you, you draw an order or a contract and get him to sign it. He's forgetful. And went on down the list, and I remember this sort of advice to younger lawyers. We came to a man and Dad said, now this man tries hard. He thinks he's honest, but he'll do a whole lot of things that you wouldn't do and you ought not to do. And I said, well, he's dishonest then. Dad said, now just a minute. He says, you young man in your 20s, you got no family. You know I'll feed you if you don't make enough money. And the lawyer we're talking about has got 5 children. He doesn't have much law practice. And he's just got to cut corners. And he says, when you've got responsibilities like that, I think the Lord in heaven looks down and says, well, I'm going to excuse him. He was trying to get food for his children. And he says, my dad, I think some lawyers should be held to a higher sense of accountability based on where they are and what their other responsibilities are. So he says, when you talk to lawyer so-and-so, don't get upset. Just remember that he can't quite hew the line like you can. And we went on down the list there. As I said, I don't remember the names. I remember some of them and some of them I was told, but no point in telling about that. And now, one more thing I think is of interest. I hope younger lawyers would think about it. I'd been a lawyer about a year, and one day I was in the office. My dad was out somewhere. We were in the 3rd floor of the we were in the Banner building, top floor of the Banner building, down on the corner where Bank of America is now, corner of Elm and Gaston Street then, Friendly. And 3 people, I believe it was a man named Shapiro and Harry Schiffman and Bill Ross. Bill Ross was a man who had a glass eye, and you never were quite sure which was the glass eye when you looked at it. They came in and wanted to see my dad about a contract, and Dad wouldn't be in for some time, and they couldn't get together. They said, well, Dick, we'll tell you about it. So Bill Ross says, we're going to go together in sort of a partnership, and I'm going to do this, this, and this. Harry here will furnish this, this, and this, and Jake will do so and so and so and so and so and so. So I wrote it all down, and they left. After lunch that day, I went into my dad's office, and I said, I've got to go a contract, but I don't know how to do it. Dad said, well, tell me about it. I said, well, and without going through it again, Ross's do this, Schiffman do that, Shapiro this. Dad said, well, write it like that, just like you told me. I said, that doesn't sound like a lawyer. This is a legal contract. Dad says, sonny boy, the sooner you forget that you've got to write like a lawyer, the better off you're going to be. There's too many damn lawyers in this town. Well, they're charged by the word, I don't know. But when they come up with one statement, they've got to say it 8 different ways and on 6 different pieces of paper. He says, you write that contract just exactly like you've told it to me, and it'll be a good legal document. And I've tried, I'm maybe bragging, but I've tried never to do 5 pages if 1 will do, or 2. I remember, by the way, lawyers sometimes are judged by their talking. I represented a lady, this was many, many years ago, and I drew a separation agreement for her. And she asked me what it was going to charge because her husband was going to pay for it. Well, I said, maybe $50. I think that's enough. She said, that's fine. He took it back to his attorney, who was one of the big firms in Greensboro here. And instead of my 4 pages, I believe it was, it turned out about 11 pages. Well, so be it. But about 3 weeks, I said, he had gotten a no good wife of his. Says, you know, she went to a jackleg lawyer, didn't charge him $1. Says, my lawyers took that and made it airtight. Says, cost me $750. But I know I've got me a thing, and my wife was ready to accept that $50 job from that lawyer.
Dick, you mentioned a moment ago your dad said to you, there are too many lawyers. I believe I heard you say that.
No, sir. I don't think. I told my mother one time, about 20 years ago, that I thought we had maybe 600 lawyers in Greensboro, including those house counsel and with the Internal Revenue and so forth. And I remember picking a figure saying, I think there's a legitimate business for maybe 289. We've got just too many lawyers. Maybe I told you that, Rip. I don't think my dad ever said there were too many.
I think it was in the context of you're asking about that contract, drawing the contract. And I thought I just...
No, he said that too many lawyers try to talk like lawyers and write like lawyers.
I see.
And they charge too much. I remember, speaking of charges, this must have been around 1938 or 39. My dad and I were discussing earnings, and Major McClendon was a good friend of my dad's, and I knew him fairly well. And I said, I'll bet Major McClendon makes $10,000 a year. My dad says, well, that's a good guess. I expect some years he makes 12 or 14,000. And I said, well, Major takes his wife up shopping in New York twice a year. I think they have a house down Riceville Beach. And it would be wonderful just to make money like that. And Dad said, well, times may change. Says, Dick, would you sign a contract to work for me for 20 years if I guaranteed to pay you $10,000 a year? I said, you just trot out that contract and I will sign it. But there, I made a little note here. That was in the days when you charged $5 for drawing a deed. A title search was $50 with a title opinion. Nobody got title insurance in those days. $50 for a title search. Drawing a will. If it was a pretty good sized estate, you charged $35. If it wasn't, you charged $25. An uncontested divorce was $75 to $100. And with fees like that, you can see that 10 grand was an awful lot of money.
And what you were referring to now is the published Greensboro bar fees, I believe.
Yes.
At one time, everybody adhered to the fees. Is that right?
Yeah, you were supposed to be unethical if you charge less than the fees. You could charge more if you wanted to, but you were not supposed to undercut anybody. That had quite a bit of opposition around Greensboro here among the lawyers, but it held up for years. Then I think the Supreme Court of the United States said that that it's sort of antitrust law violation and it stifles competition. So the Supreme Court says none of that. That was before the Supreme Court approved advertising, which you didn't ask it, but I'm going to tell you. In my opinion, the advertising, allowing lawyers to advertise, came nearer breaking down the spirit that the lawyer was viewed in the neighborhood, the community. I'll tell you about that in a second. But I think when you open up the yellow pages and here's a great big half-page lawyer saying how good they are and how they're best in the town on such and such a subject, and you find another one in the yellow pages. I don't know whether you go through the lawyer's yellow pages, but have you been hurt? I don't know whose law firm I'm talking about now. Have you been in an accident? Come to see us and we'll get you what you're entitled to. Not where we'll find out if you're entitled to anything, but we'll get it. And I have long thought that having lawyers advertise like that in the newspapers has done a great deal to lower the public's general feeling of lawyer. While we're on that subject, let me look at my notes just a minute.
Take your time.
When I was growing up, outstanding lawyers in Greensboro were very highly regarded. In the first place, not as many people in Greensboro, the total Greensboro population, not as many people had college degrees. A lawyer was generally a man who had gone to college, maybe went to law school. The old timers didn't. They just read law in somebody's office. But a lawyer was a very well educated man. A lawyer was absolutely honest. A lawyer had his fingers into a whole lot of different areas of living. And you ask your lawyer, just little things that I remember. First of all, you call your lawyer and ask him who to vote for. Whether it was the sheriff or the mayor or the president or whatever. If you get ready to buy an automobile, you call your lawyer and say, Mr. Lawyer, Mr. So-and-so, I'm thinking of a Chevrolet, but I'm thinking also about an Olds. What do you think? Because your lawyer was supposed to be, maybe not an expert, but knew more than you did about that. If I was sending my son to college, I would call my lawyer or go see him and ask him about what he thought of the different colleges. And if I were going to go to New York or go to Washington, stay there a while, I'd call my lawyer and ask him the name of good hotels in Washington, because he had been there. Nowadays, and I'll never forget this, about 3 years ago, I was at a cocktail party, and some man came up, and we chatted for a minute. He says, Miss Douglas, what business are you in? I said, I'm a lawyer. Instead of, as 20 years ago, he would have said, oh, what branch of the law are you in? Do you know my lawyer, Mr. Bernhardt? This man looked when I said, I'm a lawyer. He says, oh, and he turned and walked away. I think we brought it on ourselves. I'll get into one more little thing that bothers me. On our continuing legal education, we have to have 3 hours of ethics. And our state bar and the Greensboro bar and so forth. Now, this is just me talking. You may have disagree entirely. The courses we take for continuing legal education on ethics are 98% about what the court rules say, conflict of interest, returning calls, and so forth. Legal ethics has become, as long as you get by with following the Supreme Court's laws and rules, then you're ethical. I have yet, except one time, a lawyer from High Point on a panel got off and talked about ordinary ethics, about being honest and decent with your client and not overcharging. And I would love to see our ethics courses have something more than how to follow the rules. Well, that's off my chest.
It's a good point.
Going back a little, McNeil Smith's still around here, isn't he?
Yes, he's living out at Wellspring now.
Oh, he is.
You know, he lost his wife just recently.
I knew that.
And he's
Mac was talk of the town. Mac rode his bicycle as a young lawyer, and for years and years, McNeil Smith would ride his bicycle into town. And he would have on, well, in later years he required a helmet. He didn't have it then. And he had a little paper sack up in his little basket. I remember the first time Mac Smith, McNeil called me and said, "Dick, how about going to lunch with me? We'll go up to the Jefferson." There was a nice little restaurant on the top of the Jefferson building. And I thought Mac was quite a lawyer. I'd been practicing several years longer than he, but he was one of the big firms. So I said, "Yeah." Mac says, "Meet me up there at 12:30. So I'd already decided if Mac insisted on buying lunch, I would insist on it anyway, or flip a nickel or go Dutch. Mac walked in with a little brown paper sack. He sat down, he ordered a glass of milk, and he proceeded to open up his pack. He had 2 sandwiches, some cookies, and I ordered my regular lunch at the restaurant. And Mac was like that. Mac always brought his lunch.